Flat Stanley, His Original Adventure by Jeff Brown. Chapter 1. The Big Bulletin Board. Breakfast was ready. I will go to wake the boys, Mrs. Lanshaw said to her husband, George Lanshaw. Just then their younger son, Arthur, came from the bedroom he shared with his brother Stanley. Hey, come and look. Hey! Mr. and Mrs. Lanshaw were both very much in favor of politeness and careful speech. Hay is for horses, Arthur, not people, Mr. Lanshaw said as they entered the bedroom. Try to remember that. Excuse me, Arthur said, but look! He pointed to Stanley's bed. Across it lay an enormous bulletin board that Mr. Lanshaw had given the boys a Christmas ago so that they could pin up pictures and messages and maps. It had fallen during the night on top of Stanley, but Stanley was not hurt. In fact, he would still have been sleeping if he had not been woken by his brother's shout. What's going on here? He called out cheerfully from beneath the enormous board. Mr. and Mrs. Lanshaw hurried to lift it from the bed. Heavens, said Mrs. Lanshaw. Gosh, said Arthur. Stanley's flat. As a pancake, said Mrs. Lanshaw. Darndest thing I've ever seen. Let's all have breakfast, Mrs. Lanshaw said. Then Stanley and I will go see Dr. Dan and hear what he has to say. In his office, Dr. Dan exclaimed, Stanley's all over.
Examine
Stanley all over. How do you feel? He asked. Does it hurt very much? I felt sort of tickly for a while after I got up, Stanley Lanshaw said, but I feel fine now. Well, that's mostly how it's with these cases, said Dr. Dan. We'll just have to keep an eye on this young fellow, he said when he had finished the examination. Sometimes we doctors, despite all our years of training and experience, can only marvel at how little we really know. Mrs. Lanshaw said she thought Stanley's clothes would have to be altered by the tailor now, so Dr. Dan told his nurse to take Stanley's measurements. Mrs. Lanshaw wrote them down. Stanley was 4 feet tall, about a foot wide, and a half-inch thick. Chapter 2. Being Flat. When Stanley was used of being flat, he enjoyed it. He could go in and out of 2 rooms, even when the door was closed, just by lying down and sliding through the crack at the bottom. Mr. and Mrs. Lanshaw said it was silly, but they were quite proud of him. Arthur got jealous and tried to slide under a door, but he just banged his head. Oh. Being flat could also be helpful, Stanley found. He was taking a walk with Mrs. Lanshaw one afternoon when her favorite ring fell from her finger. The ring rolled across the sidewalk and down between the bars of a grating that covered a deep dark shaft. Mrs. Lanshaw began to cry. I have an idea, Stanley said. He took the laces out of his shoes and an extra pair out of his pocket and tied them all together to make one long lace. Then He tied one of the end to the back of his belt and gave the other end to his mother. "Lower me," he said, "and I'll look for the ring." "Thank you, Stanley," said Mrs. Lathrop. She lowered him between the bars and moved him carefully up and down from side to side so that he could search the whole floor of the shaft. 2 policemen came by and stared at Mrs. Lathrop as she stood holding the long lace that ran down through the grating. She pretended not to notice them. "What's the matter, lady?" the first policeman asked. "Is your yo-yo stuck?" "I'm not playing with a yo-yo," Mrs. Lathrop said sharply. "My son is at the other end of this lace, if you must know." "Get the net, Harry," said the second policeman. "We've caught a cuckoo." Just then, down the shaft, Stanley cried out, "Hooray!" Mrs. Lathrop pulled him up and saw that he had the ring. "Good for you, Stanley," she said. Then she turned angrily to the policeman. "A cuckoo, indeed," she said. "Shame!" The policeman apologized. "We didn't get it, lady," they said. "We had been hasty. Oh, we see that now. People should think twice before making rude remarks," said Mrs. Lathrop, "and then not make them at all." The policeman realized that it was a good rule and said they would try to remember it. One day, Stanley got a letter from his friend Thomas Anthony Jeffrey, whose family had moved recently to California. A school vacation was about to begin, and Stanley was invited to spend it with the Jeffreys. "Oh, boy," Stanley said, "I would love to go." Mr. Lathrop sighed. "A round-trip train or an airplane ticket to California is very expensive," he said. "I'll have to go think of some cheaper way." When Mr. Lathrop came home from the office that evening, she bought him with an enormous brown paper envelope. "Now then, Stanley," he said, "try for this size." The envelope fit Stanley very well. There was even room left over, Mrs. Lathrop discovered, for an XL sandwich made with thin bread and a toothbrush case filled with milk. They had to put great many stamps on the envelope to pay for both airmail and inchkins, but it was still much less expensive than a train or an airplane ticket to California. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Lathrop slipped Stanley into an envelope along with the egg-salad sandwich and the toothbrush case full of milk and mailed them from the box from the corner. The envelope had to be folded to fit through the slot, but Stanley was a limber boy, and inside the box he straightened right up again. Mrs. Lathrop was nervous because Stanley had never been away from his home alone before. "Can you hear me, dear?" she called. "Are you all right?" Stanley's voice came quite clearly. "I'm fine. Can I eat my sandwich now?" "Wait an hour and try not to get overheated, dear," Mrs. Lathrop said. Then she and Mr. Lathrop cried out, "Goodbye, goodbye," and went home. Stanley had a fine time on California. When the visit was over, the Jeffreys returned him a beautiful white envelope they had made themselves. It had red and blue markings to show that it was airmail, and Thomas Jeffrey had lettered it "valuable" and "fragile." This ended up on both sides. Back at home, Stanley told his family that he had handled so carefully he never had felt a single bump. Mr. Lashoff said it proved that Jack's plays were wonderful, and so was the postal service, and that this was a great age which to live in. Stanley thought so too.